As President Truman set off to meet Churchill and Stalin at Potsdam in Germany, the debate about the invasion plan still raging, he knew that within days he might have a deadly alternative to end the war, a new and terrible weapon that would force Japan into surrender.
The late President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill laid plans for the $2 billion project to develop the atomic bomb.
The program to make an atomic bomb had been given the go-ahead by President Roosevelt in 1941. It was a project of the utmost urgency. Both the Germans and the Japanese were exploring ways of splitting the atom to create the most destructive weapon in history. For 4 years, the research was conducted in total secrecy. Truman was only told of the project when he became president in April 1945. Churchill knew, but their ally Stalin didn't find out until late July. The American Joint Chiefs of Staff knew, but General MacArthur, the man whose job it was to plan the invasion of Japan, was kept in the dark.
George Marshall, he did not trust MacArthur's discretion. If he had told MacArthur about the atomic bomb, it's entirely conceivable that MacArthur would have let the Navy know that the Army was up to something really big and it was going to drive the Navy crazy and they just have to wait and see. Given his volatile temperament, nobody told MacArthur until the bomb was on its way to the Pacific.
The man on whose shoulders rest the crushing responsibilities of the coming conference and the winning of a war against Japan takes time to eat and chat with American sailors. He is the president of a democracy.
Even in July 1945, as Truman sailed to Europe for the Potsdam Conference of Allied leaders, it was not clear when the atomic bomb would become available. Indeed, it was by no means certain that the bomb would work. For the moment, there were other priorities. One key issue was to get agreement from Stalin to launch a counter-invasion against Japanese troops in Manchuria. This might prove the decisive event that would make a costly invasion of Japan unnecessary.
The Big Three, now united against the Jap. The American view at Potsdam was accepted by the Soviets, the view that the war in the Pacific must be ended quickly.
U.S. intelligence and British intelligence reckoned as early as September 1944 that when the attack by the Russians came, as it was expected, that would collapse what was left of Japanese resistance and the war would end. The President was advised that that was highly likely. Moreover, if it were the case that this didn't work, there were still 3 full months before even the first landing could occur in November. There was plenty of time to use the bomb thereafter if the recommended options failed.
On July 16th, the day after Truman arrived at Potsdam, came news that changed utterly the way in which the war against Japan would end. Truman received a cable. It read, "Operated on this morning. Diagnosis not yet complete, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations." The first atomic bomb had been tested successfully at a remote site in New Mexico. The sound was heard 100 miles away, the light 180 miles away. Windows broke 235 miles away. This was the weapon Truman described as the most terrible bomb.
For Truman, once he had the bomb, using the bomb was an easy and obvious decision. Truman had no illusions about the impact of the bomb or the power of the bomb. This is the most terrible weapon that man has ever built, and one bomb can wipe out a city. It's just that it seemed like the best way to end the war as quickly as possible.
He's got Okinawa on his mind, and he knows what the invasion of Okinawa cost.
Let's not forget that we are fighting for peace and for the welfare of mankind. We're not fighting for conquest.
He also knows that the test doesn't mean the whole thing's going to work. It's a field test of a weapon. And maybe what we're going to have on our hands is just a big dud line, some Japanese city and they get a chance to analyze it.
We want peace and prosperity for the world as a whole.
He signs off on a memo that said when the right weather appears and when the men in command of the bomb unit feel it's time to bomb, then go ahead and do it.
At Potsdam, Truman broke the news to Stalin about the atomic weapon that America now possessed. His reaction was muted, but he agreed to launch the decisive invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria in August.
At Potsdam, Russia agreed to declare war.
But hopes of a diplomatic initiative that would remove the need for either the atomic bomb or an invasion were dashed at Potsdam. Some, even within the Truman administration, believed that the final declaration should have made it clear that Japan could retain the imperial throne, provided the military totally capitulated. But the final Potsdam Declaration ended with a blunt demand for unconditional surrender.
We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim unconditional surrender. The alternative is prompt and utter destruction.
Diplomacy was not going to work because there simply was no middle ground on which both sides could meet. The Japanese final position was not simply preservation of the imperial system or the emperor. It was preservation of the old order in Japan, the old order in which the militarists were dominant and which had given the world a war of aggression that had killed upwards of 17 million people.
It is clear that there are three conditions beyond retention of the emperor that the military would insist upon. The first of these is no occupation. The second of these is that the Japanese army would be responsible for demobilization. Third, the Japanese army would be responsible for war crimes trials. Can you imagine?
To this day, the question of whether the terms of the surrender should have been modified remains a controversial one. Some historians have detected in Truman's refusal to budge on the issue another agenda, relating more to the oncoming Cold War with the Soviet Union, but one for which the Japanese citizens of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would pay a heavy price.
Every major advisor in the United States government and the British government, plus the intelligence, all advised to change the terms and to change them early so that the political implications could be digested, with one exception.
President Truman with Secretary Burns at the conference where an American-British-Chinese ultimatum to Japan was issued.
The one exception, so far as we know, is Secretary of State Burns, James Burns, who was very close to Truman, indeed had been his mentor in the Senate, was a very eminent American leader, and had very hard-line views on this subject.
Japan is warned by the American Secretary of State.
My hope is that the people of Japan will now realize that further resistance to the forces of the nation, now united in the enforcement of law and justice, will be absolutely futile. There is still time, but little time, for the Japanese to save themselves from the destruction which threatens them.
Burns himself was most concerned about the Russians, and he is the central figure advising and controlling Truman on this against the advice of virtually everyone else, so far as you can tell from the documentation. And his view is, as he told one of the scientists in May of 1945, that he understood the war could be ended, but the bomb had to be used to make the Russians more manageable, particularly in Eastern Europe, was what he told one of the scientists. And there's other evidence that he saw the bomb as a major factor in anti-Soviet diplomacy.
Whether to end the war against Japan or as a demonstration to Stalin of American military might, as the Potsdam Conference broke up, America was on the brink of unleashing its first atomic weapon on Hiroshima.
The Enola Gay's mission starts from Tinian in the Marianas. Only yesterday they have been told of the true power of the weapon they are to carry. The massive bomb has been loaded.
Any avenue of ending the war, aside from use of the bomb, had pretty much darkened to the point of looking impossible.